do it. Our next speaker. So get this, we flew in Father Jonathan from Mexico, and the reason why I was saying like 3 Mississippi is because our speaker, Dr. Kevin Stewart, we actually flew him in from Mississippi. Actually, that's where we booked the flights. Don't we put him on a good airline, Southwest, not Spirit. Don't worry. And just to intro Dr. Kevin Stewart, so he's an assistant professor of political science, director of the Master in Public Policy and Admissions program, and a director of the Catholic Studies program. Previously, he served as president of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, a social science research institute in Austin, Texas, and he received his PhD from UT Austin, where he studied public law and political philosophy and was a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. He earned a Master's of Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science after receiving undergrad degrees in history and English literature from LSU. He and his wife have 3 children and are constantly working on their 100-year-old house. And our fun questions for Dr. Kevin Stewart is the same. Would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses or 1 horse-sized duck?
One horse-sized duck, because I like to know who my enemy is.
Good answer. Your second question is, if you could eliminate any word from the English language, what would it be?
First one that comes to mind is to eliminate the word like, because we all use it too much, so it would actually force us to think more about what we're going to say. So there we go. All right, ready? All right. Well, good morning, everyone, or actually now I guess it's good afternoon. Thanks for having me today. Thanks for being here today and coming together to talk about some really important things. I want to give you a little context before we get kicked off. One is, as a Catholic who works in the social sciences, I believe we can be fearless about the search for truth. There is only one truth. It is all God's, and nothing that we could find scientifically could possibly contradict a tenet of the faith. And in a way, that's really freeing. It means that we can just be free to ask the questions that we're interested in asking, to go in pursuit of the answers with no holds barred, without really a fear of what we're going to find. Indeed, it also affects the kinds of questions that we ask. So, and that's related to what we're going to talk about today, because I often find myself asking, if the faith is true, what would we expect to see in the numbers? Like, if what the faith teaches is true, we should be able to see the fruits of that out there in the world. And what would it look like if we were to see such a thing? Alternatively, do the truths of the faith offer a way of understanding, even in a secular way? Do they point us to things that we otherwise might have missed that the data is trying to tell us? And we'll come back to these questions, I think, repeatedly, but for now, that's enough to orient us as to why we're going to talk a lot more about stats and data for the next few minutes than what the Catechism says. So there's conventional wisdom about marriage today. One phenomenon and a couple of different, it breaks along a couple of different tracks, right? One is marriage is in decline. So I've got a graph and chart because I would be kicked out of the organizations of social scientists if I did not have at least one graph or chart. So I have for you a graph here, that shows married on the solid line and never married, this is in the US, on the dotted line. And I want you to notice 2 things. One, not just how much things have changed, but actually these 2 positions have totally swapped places, but also the speed with which that has happened. This year is not 1900. That is not a typo. That is since 2000. So that is in the last 22 years. That is the decline of marriage in the United States. It's been massive. Now, there are a couple of different things going on, right? So one, you get an attack on marriage from what I would call mostly like academic circles. So marriage is out, you'll hear these things though, especially in our milieu, in the university. Marriage is an outdated, patriarchal, misogynistic institution. And you'll hear another version of that that's a deconstruction, right? So it's just a piece of paper. Why do you need to register your love at a government office? Why do you need their permission to live your lives together? You don't need this. You don't need marriage, right? Track 2 is sort of oddly, I mean, these two exist at the same time. Track 2 is sort of oddly the opposite, which is it's a rejection of marriage via placing it on a pedestal so high that we can never get there. So this one is more subtle because it still respects marriage, but it misunderstands it. So it says, I need to travel first. I need to get my career going first. I need to be financially successful first. I need to play the field a bit first. I need to find my soulmate, right? And so it delays, we delay and delay and delay. And so the average age of marriage has now reached 30 for both men and women. Just recently, women crossed this threshold. So more cultural context. It's pretty rocky out there right now. So we have record unhappiness. Gallup takes a poll where they ask about how happy people are, and last year reported the highest rates of unhappiness and the lowest rates of happiness that they've ever recorded. We see skyrocketing suicides and deaths of despair. When you combine deaths from alcohol abuse and drug overdose, they add up, so-called, and suicides, so deaths of despair, as these are called, they add up to be the 4th largest killer in the country. Only cancer, heart disease, and COVID kill more people than deaths of despair. So we also see additional atomization and the general decline of institutions. You know, we are being isolated and atomized one from the other. Institutions in society in which people used to have robust participation, through which they used to find meaning and exercise meaning in their lives, have been declining. People don't join the Kiwanis Club. They don't go to Rotary Club meetings, garden clubs, book societies, that sort of the things that used to fill our days are now those days are filled largely with entertainment, but entertainment that we enjoy solo, right? One-on-one. So this is all what our culture tells us in our classrooms and shows us in our entertainment and reinforces so widely and deeply in everything from movies to the tax code, so that we may even think these are our own thoughts, even though they're the thoughts of other people. Now the thing is this, you're now adults, and many of you already feel the pull of life's big questions. What does my life mean? What is happiness, and how do I get it? What am I called to be and do with my life? And you're asking those questions at just the moment when there's an almost total loss of confidence in anyone you could look to in order to help you answer those questions. Our society offers you no plausible answer readily to those questions. And I guess really that's why we're here today, is to work through this together. So what then particularly does does data tell us? So data tells us a different story than what our society is feeding us generally. And so some of the things the data tells us may be surprising. So let's turn first to the common sense of our fellow countrymen. When people are asked what provides them a sense of meaning, Americans by far say family more than anything else. So that's this one. It's hard to see. This is 69%. This is an open-ended question. They did not provide the answers. They just asked people. What provides them a sense of meaning. And 69% said family. The next closest is career. More than 2 to 1 say family over the next closest answer. In the next one, they asked them, so this is more what's called a closed-ended question, where they did provide them the answers and they selected from among them. And they asked them, what's the most important source of meaning? So not just where do you get your meaning, but what's the most important? What's the architectonic one? What's shaping everything else? Again here, the answers are not shocking. Spending time with family, 40%. Religious faith, 20%. Nothing else even close, right? Family and faith, top two answers, nothing else even in the same ballpark, right? The next closest one is 6, and that's caring for pets. So, when this reminds me of one of my favorite studies of all time in social science. Incredibly expensive and difficult and time-consuming to do, and so there's just a lot to learn from it. Harvard University undertook this study on happiness. It's one of the most extraordinary studies in social science history. They followed 456 poor people and 268 Harvard grads for nearly 80 years. Only 19 are still alive, and they're all in their 90s. The researchers followed up regularly with hundreds of questionnaires and surveys. But they also did blood tests, DNA tests, MRI scans, and full health checks. The study began in 1938 and is still going, now following the children and grandchildren of the original participants. Based on measurements taken when the study's participants were middle-aged, the biggest predictor of health and longevity at 80 was not their cholesterol level, was not their blood pressure, not long-lived ancestors, or even genetics. It was the strength of their relationships, especially their marriage. In other words, of all the factors they measured and studied, the one that best predicted who would live to be 80 and how healthy they would be at that age was the strength of their marriage. I want to quote Harvard's website on the study. It said, it's hard for you to read there, so I'm just going to read that bit to you. Close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives, the study revealed. Those ties protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or even genes. The effects carried over to mental health, too. They experienced less mental deterioration as they aged, smoked less, and drank alcohol more moderately. A related study found that people who had happy marriages in their 80s reported that their moods didn't suffer, even on days when they had more physical pain. Those who had unhappy marriages felt both more emotional and more physical pain. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit. So what this is all telling us then is that these are the real rings of power, right? These are the real rings of power. Because a good, strong marriage positively affects virtually everything else in people's lives. It is almost like magic when you look at the data. It's so profound. So I want to hit you with some of those stats in breaking this down. The TLDR version is that our culture is lying to us about marriage, but our church is not. The data really do show in an overwhelming and convincing fashion that this old institution still has a lot to give to human life, human meaning, and human happiness. Okay, so here are a few. Married people are happier than non-married people, about 50% more likely to report being happy. Married people are measurably healthier with respect to both physical health and mental health. Married people have fewer health conditions in the first place and faster recovery times when they do get sick. Married people are even more likely than non-married people to survive cancer. All right, so our culture tells us that marriage will tie you down and limit your happiness. What the data tells us is that it's going to make you both physically healthier and mentally healthier. More lies, a second lie from our culture. Our culture tells you that marriage will limit your personal success and flourishing. What the data says is actually married people report higher education levels. Married people are more likely to have a job. Married people are more likely to own a home. Married people have greater economic mobility. Married people are less likely to live in poverty. Now, this one is especially for the men in the room because all this is true, and in fact, marriage has an even heavier emphasis or an even bigger effect on women's happiness than on men's. but has an even bigger effect on men's success than women's. So everybody gets something out of it. And that is this: men who are married get more promotions and faster promotions, they make more money, and they report greater satisfaction with their sex life. So if more promotions, more money, and great sex sounds like something you'd be interested in, maybe consider marriage, guys. Right? So so let's talk for a minute about the flip side of the coin too, because we also see the truths of the church's teachings on marriage by way of when marriage fails, which is to say divorce. That same Harvard study that tells us that long marriage to one person, that strength of relationships is the key to happiness, also tells us that long marriage to one person is the top ingredient in the formula for a long, happy, healthy life. It's perhaps not surprising then that the data also tells us that divorce hits us like death. And I mean that literally. It has about the same effects on physical and mental health as spousal death. It is immense trauma that too often our culture avoids and lets fester, because we have all these cultural forces telling us that it's supposed to be easy and normal and not that big a deal, right? There are a lot of people hurting today from wounds inflicted in their childhood by the destabilizing forces of divorce. So again, here, our culture tells us that we can have a nice divorce and that the kids wouldn't want us to be unhappy. And all that isn't true. Kids do better in every conceivable way of measuring things when they grow up in a two-parent home. Take academic outcomes, for example. Whether a child lives with mom and dad is a better predictor of academic performance than any fact about their school, including per-student spending, class size, and all the other factors that we look for in judging education. It's whether mom and dad are married that matters most. One day, if you're blessed with kids, you're going to want them to grow up and remain faithful Catholics. The number one factor that predicts whether someone remains a faithful Catholic as an adult is whether their parents were married all the way through their childhood. In fact, everyone knows that church has been on a half-century decline. Participation in church has been on a half-century decline. But if we control for just that one variable, whether your parents were married all the way through 18 in your childhood, that decline goes away. You're just as likely to attend church twice a month or more, which is the way this is typically measured, as people were 100 years ago, if your parents were married. Finally, our church, preeminently among Christian churches, centers marriage in human life, and especially the importance of a lifelong commitment. And so it's no surprise then to learn in the data that everybody gets more happiness out of marriage, and that Christians get even more happiness out of marriages than other groups. So what do we do? So what then, right? Well, the first thing I'd say is don't do what I did, right? Do what I say, not what I did, because I was in my 30s before I got married. Be open to considering your vocation now. And don't be afraid to pursue meaningful relationships now that might one day result in marriage. Because I can tell you this, as someone who got married in his 30s and who is 45 chasing a one-year-old around, it's a young man's game. But I'd also say this, someday I'm going to die. And when I die, I'll most want to be united for eternity with our Lord. But second to that, and probably just barely, I'll want another decade with my wife and my kids and our grandkids. That's what I'll want in this life more than anything else, is more time with the family. And so don't fall for the traps of a culture that's right now very sick, and in its sickness is trying to isolate us, to make us atomized consumers of products and one another. Ultimately, if the gospel is true, and if church teachings are true, what then would we expect the data to tell us? Well, humans are born into families, thick networks of human relationships, meaningful relationships. Humans flourish in and because of these deep relationships. Our mental health and physical health both take their shape from these relationships, and marriage is the most important of these fundamental human relationships. And indeed, that is exactly what we see. Now, I haven't addressed the theological side all that much, and I'm happy to talk in Q&A or over lunch about that. Here, I was only keen to make the argument that at the natural level of human existence, marriage is a core part of what makes most of us happy and flourishing people. And if the countercultural idea of getting married and starting a family when you're still in your 20s, while also pursuing career success, makes your heart race a little, I would just bring us back. I have the words of one pope up here. I would bring us ultimately back to the words of another pope, St. John Paul II. Be not afraid. Thank you. So I tried to leave some time for Q&A. I hope we have a little. Yes? No? Okay. All right. So are there questions? Yes. Yes, I can provide a list of sources for anybody who would like to read some on this. Probably your best bet as a great starting place is one of our professors here at UT, Mark Regnerus, wrote a book called The Future of Christian Marriage. That's a very good source. Mark Regnerus, Regnerus, Regnerus. And then he has a colleague named Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, who's head of the Institute for Family Studies. That's a website well worth touring around. There's a lot of good data there. Yes?
You were talking about like not doing what you did, waiting until you were like 30. When do you think is like the appropriate time at this stage of life for us to start consider like is now a good time for this, and like what is for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a fair amount of, there's sort of general discernment, and then there's like specific to you. So what the data can tell us is there's something called the success sequence that says if the answer is regarding like poverty, right? So material life success. The success sequence says what the data tells us is graduate high school, get a job, get married, have kids, and do it in that order. Right? Don't do that out of order. It's when people do that out of order that things go wrong. If they do it in that order, there's like a 98% chance that they won't ever live in poverty. Now, so that's sort of general, which means that all of you are basically in the zone, right? Because you're all full adults now. The thing to avoid is like teenage pregnancy, especially out of wedlock teenage pregnancy. But done in the right order. We have to be mindful. My wife and I have 3 kids. 2 are adopted and 1 is biological. And part of that undoubtedly was the fact that we weren't married till our mid-30s. So we're trying to have kids pretty late in the game for both men and women. And the fertility of both men and women is declining at that point. And so one thing that's worth remembering is if we're going to be open to life, the earlier we start, the more kids taking care of us when we're old there might be. My wife's favorite brother, I think she'd be okay with my calling him that. My wife's favorite brother has 8. At 45 with 3, we are obviously never going to have 8, right? That is just not going to happen for us. Francis.
Yeah, what does a woman need to believe in order to be happy within a marriage and in order to contribute significantly to a marriage? Because for me, surrounded by the people in my life, that's a very important question for me to suss out from them.
Yeah, that question is in some sense probably better directed to my wife, but she's not here, so I'll have to stumble along as best I can. One of the things she has persuaded me of, I'm sure it's not the only thing. So let me start by saying massive income is not necessary. We find, you guys may be aware of this, but when it comes to money in life, the first $30,000 or so is really useful. It buys you things like food and clothes and shelter. The next $30,000 to $40,000 is also pretty useful, but after that, we find basically no additional happiness comes from additional money. So it's not money. And neither men nor women actually mind all that much a difference in the educational level, because of course women have outnumbered men in college since around 1980. So at this point we have significantly more women who are college educated than we have men who are college educated. So you're often seeing a sort of misalignment there. They're not identical. That's not actually a big deal. But what does turn out to be a deal is, unless it's specifically talked about and addressed, in premarital formation, it's still the preference of most couples that men make more money. So that can create an issue. But I think that one is settled by what my wife has persuaded me of over the years, and that is one thing that's crucially important to a marriage that's often neglected is that the woman has to be able to respect the man. Like, if she doesn't have respect for who he is, for what he does, for what he's about, then that relationship is not going to go well. And that's one part, because that's one aspect of love that we often just don't talk about. We do a good job talking about lots of other things. I would say, given comparisons to past generations, both men and women are sort of more emotionally engaged and emotionally in touch with who they are and what they're about than was often the case in previous generations. But what we don't do a good job of talking about is that respect and admiration piece, which Deanne has successfully persuaded me is a very important part of a good, solid, strong marriage. Yes?
Or we're going to do one more question.
Okay. Okay, I heard, so for anyone who didn't hear that, he asked, what was the primary reason for waiting until my 30s to get married? Well, like most things in life, it'll be multi-causal, right? There's not often one cause, there are often lots of causes. Certainly one of them was just being pulled along by the cultural drift. So I'm a convert. I wasn't Catholic till 2014. Grew up in a good, solid Protestant home, very faithful believers. But pulled along by sort of general culture on a number of things, and this is one of them. I probably believed that I needed to be financially successful. First, get my travel wiggles out before getting married and having kids and all those sorts of things. And it isn't true. And we can see that it isn't true in the data because middle age tends to be a particularly rough patch for human beings. I think it's you hit that midpoint in life and start to assess what you've done and what remains. There's often a lot of tough times in that period. And what we see especially in that is that marriage is really a buffer against that, that even people who have large networks of friends or report very deep networks of friends with whom they spend a lot of time, that does not protect them against the unhappiness of middle age the way that marriage does. So that's where we really come to see it bear. So I think I probably bought in on a lot of what our culture is selling right now. It's hard not to, right? Advertising works, or we wouldn't spend so much money doing it. And then, of course, there's always the individual discernment. It isn't like I didn't date in my 20s. I did. And so for reasons of cultural structures, it was harder for me to meet a woman that I should marry than it might have been in the past. So Dr. Regnerus also writes some good stuff about that in a different book. But I think it was harder. I mean, I even did some of the online dating stuff, which was really difficult. So I think it's hard. It's hard, and we have to, as groups, recognizing that now, and I think the church is starting to see that. We have to. One of the ways that we have to be countercultural is to create little anti-environments, Marshall McLuhan called them, little anti-environments where we foster exactly those things that conduce to flourishing and happiness that the culture is either not providing or actively working against. All right, that's supposed to be it, right? So lunchtime?
Yeah, let's give it up for Dr. Stuart. All right, y'all, we're going to be transitioning into lunchtime. If you have any other questions or any questions about any of the talks that we're going to have or that we had already, there will be a panel discussion at the end, so then you could